In the summer of 1981, a brilliant young valedictorian named Tanya Maxwell walked away from her own graduation ceremony and vanished from the face of the earth. In the racially charged climate of her small South Carolina town, the police were quick to accept a convenient lie. She was just another runaway, a black girl with big ideas who had simply left her small life behind for 25 years. That lie was allowed to stand, leaving a mother trapped in a quarter century of silent, unresolved grief. The town, the school, the very ground itself held a terrible secret. Then, in 2006, a construction crew began clearing land at the old high school and unearthed an impossibility, a truth buried for a generation, one that would tear an old lie apart at the seams. Before we begin, thank you for being here. It's important that these stories are told, that we give voice to those who are so cruelly silenced. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, what time it is in your part of the world. It means a great deal to know that we are in this together, bearing witness to the truth. Now, let me tell you what really happened to Tanya Maxwell on the high school football field. Hundreds of folding chairs were arranged in neat rows, their occupants fanning themselves with their programs for Eleanor Maxwell. Tanya's mother sitting in the third row. The oppressive heat was a distant sensation. All she could feel was a swelling pride, so immense, so radiant, it seemed to push the very air away, creating a perfect crystalline moment in time. Her husband, Robert, a gentle giant, a man whose hands were callous from a lifetime of work at the local mill, sat beside her. His large hand enveloped hers, his knuckles white, his eyes fixed on a makeshift stage where their daughter, their Tanya, stood as a testament to everything they had ever hoped for. Tanya was a vision in her crisp white cap and gown, the gleaming gold valedictorian sash, a brilliant slash of victory against the fabric at 17. She possessed a poise that made her seem impossibly mature, a self-assurance that was both her greatest strength and, in a town like King Street Junction, her most profound vulnerability. Her voice, clear and steady, carried over the rustling programs and the muffled coughs of the restless crowd. She wasn't just reading a pre-written speech. She was issuing a declaration of intent, a manifesto for a future she planned to seize with both hands. The future is not a path we find, Tanya said, her eyes so like her father's, sweeping over the faces of her classmates. It is a road we must build. We build it with the tools of education, with a mortar of integrity, and with the courage to lay our own foundation, brick by brick, even on ground that was not prepared for us. Eleanor saw Mrs. Gable, the high school English teacher who had loaned Tanya books from her own personal library, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. She saw their pastor, Reverend Michael, nodding slowly, a deep, knowing smile spreading across his face. This was their child, Robert's and Eleanor's, a girl who had devoured classic literature in a town that offered few books and even fewer opportunities. A girl who saw a universe of possibility beyond the tobacco fields and segregated histories of Florence County. The full academic scholarship to Duke University wasn't just a ticket out of a predetermined life. It was a validation of every late night she'd spent studying at the kitchen table, every sacrifice they had made, every quiet prayer Eleanor had ever uttered. But as Eleanor's proud gaze scanned the crowd, her eyes inevitably found the Jacksons. They sat near the front, a place of honor befitting their status as one of the town's founding white families. Bo Jackson, their only son, was seated with the other graduates just a few feet from Tanya. But he might as well have been on another planet. He wasn't looking at the stage. He was staring at his own hands, his handsome face a mask of stone-cold fury. Every word of praise for Tanya was in his eyes, a personal and public insult. He was the son of John Jackson, a man whose family money came from the very land their ancestors had once forced others to work, the valedictorian spot, the prestigious Duke Scholarship. These were things the Jacksons had simply assumed were Beau's. By birthright, he had been named salutatorian, the second place honor, and for him it was a profound humiliation. His resentment had been a palpable poison in the school hallways for months, a low, ugly whisper campaign suggesting Tanya had only been given the honor because she was black. A token gesture of the changing times, everyone knew the truth. Tanya had simply outworked him, outthought him, and outdreamed him. And Bo Jackson, it was clear, could not stand it when the ceremony finally concluded with the triumphant toss of mortarboards into the hazy sky. The crowd surged forward, a wave of pastel dresses and polyester suits. Eleanor and Robert were momentarily caught in the crush of well-wishers, all wanting to hug Tanya, to shake her hand and touch the hem of her brilliant future. That girl's going places, Eleanor heard a man say to his wife, a credit to her people. A woman added a comment that was meant as a compliment, but still carried the familiar bitter sting of separation. They were still their people, not just people. Through a gap in the crowd, Eleanor saw her daughter laughing, her face all light with a pure, unadulterated joy of a 17-year-old on the absolute cusp of everything she had ever wanted. She was accepting a small, slightly wilted bouquet of roses from her grandmother when Eleanor saw him. Bo Jackson was approaching, moving with a practiced, easy charm that was his family's trademark. A pleasant, empty smile was plastered on his face, a smile that never once reached his cold, calculating eyes. He waited for a lull in the congratulations. A master of timing then stepped smoothly into the space. "Tanya," he said, his voice as smooth and sweet as molasses. That was some speech, really, something special. Tanya, ever gracious, ever willing to believe in the good of people even when they had shown her none, smiled back at him. "Thank you, Bo. That means a lot coming from you." Eleanor started to move toward them, a prickle of deep maternal unease crawling up her skin. Robert's hand on her arm held her back gently. "Let her have her moment, Eleanor," he murmured, his voice full of pride. But a mother's intuition is a powerful primal thing. And Eleanor's was screaming a silent alarm. "I was just wondering." Bo continued, lowering his voice, creating a bubble of false intimacy around the two of them. "I was really struck by what you said about building your own road. I'd love to talk to you about it. Just for a minute, away from all this noise." He gestured vaguely toward the dark line of long-leaf pines that bordered the school property, a dense wall of trees behind the brick gymnasium. "It's quieter back there. I want to understand your perspective." It was a masterful performance of contrition. He sounded impressed, humbled like a bitter rival, finally admitting defeat and graciously seeking wisdom. Eleanor watched as Tanya hesitated for just a fraction of a second. The offer was strange. The proposed location, stranger still. But Bo was an expert at preying on her best qualities, her empathy, her deep-seated desire to bridge divides and find common ground. "Okay, Bo," she finally said, her generous smile returning just for a minute. She turned and gave her mother a little wave, a silent promise that she would be right back, just going to talk to Bo for a second. She called out over the joyful noise. Eleanor watched her daughter walk away, her brilliant white gown a stark beacon against the green grass, following the boy, who had sat with resentment all afternoon. She watched as they rounded the corner of the brick gymnasium. Two figures, one so full of light, the other consumed by darkness, being swallowed by the long, grasping shadows of the setting sun. It was the last time Eleanor Maxwell would ever see her daughter alive. The moment they were out of sight of the lingering crowds, the manufactured charm evaporated from Bo Jackson's face like mist in a harsh sun. The curated, polite smile vanished, replaced by the raw, ugly sneer that Eleanor had glimpsed from a distance. The secluded spot behind the school, shielded from view by the solid brick wall of the gymnasium and the encroaching pine woods, was no place for a thoughtful, philosophical conversation. It was a place for an ambush. "You really think you're something special, don't you?" he spat. His voice was no longer the smooth baritone of a southern gentleman, but a low, guttural snarl freighted with months of festering indignation. Tanya stopped, her own smile faltering as the first cold tendrils of genuine fear touched her. This was not the contrite classmate he had pretended to be. This was the real Bo. "What are you talking about, Bo?" she asked, her voice still admirably calm, still attempting to find the reasonable ground that with him had never truly existed. "That speech," he said, stepping closer deliberately, invading her personal space, forcing her back toward the trees. "All that garbage about building our own road. You think you built anything? Everything you have was given to you. That scholarship, that valedictorian sash, that was mine. My father sits on the board of trustees at Duke. That was my spot. They gave it to you. To look good, you're a charity case, a diversity quota, and you're too stupid to even see it." The words were meticulously chosen, daggers designed to wound, to strip away her achievement, and reframe it as a demeaning handout. But Tanya Maxwell was not a girl who broke easily. She was the daughter of Robert and Eleanor, and she had been taught to stand her ground. Her spine, which had been so straight and proud at the podium, stiffened with defiance. "I earned that scholarship, Bao," she said, her voice dropping all pleasantries, now sharp and clear as shattered glass. "Earn my grades. I earned that sash. You know it, and I know it, and the only thing you can't stand is the truth. You can't stand that a black girl from the other side of King Street Junction could be smarter than you." She had spoken to one simple truth his fragile, entitled ego could not bear. The truth was a lit match, and his suffocating rage was a barrel of gasoline. In that instant, whatever control he possessed completely disintegrated. His handsome face contorted into something unrecognizable, and he was no longer a popular, privileged boy from a good family. He was a monster, unmasked. He lunged at her, his hands outstretched, not to grab, but to shove. The sound that was torn from Tanya's throat was not a word, but a short, sharp cry of pure shock and pain as he slammed her backward. With all his weight she stumbled, her dressed shoes, bought specially for this day, failing to find purchase in the soft earth. She fell hard against the rough, unforgiving bark of a massive old oak tree that stood like a silent ancient sentinel at the very edge of the woods. The violence was a shocking, brutal explosion of pin-up hatred. He was on her in an instant, his rage blinding him to everything but the desperate primal need to erase her, to shatter the person who was a living, breathing symbol of his own inadequacy. It was not a calculated act of murder. It was a storm of pure, unrestrained fury, a pathetic tantrum with deadly consequences. When it was over, there was only a horrifying, ringing stillness. The mundane sounds of the woods, the chirp of crickets, the rustle of leaves rushed in to fill the void, left by a life extinguished. Tanya, the brilliant, vibrant girl who was supposed to change the world, lay at the base of the old oak, her bright future snuffed out in a burst of brutal, racist jealousy, panic, cold, and sharp as a shard of ice. Finally pierced through Bose's rage, he stared at what he had done, at the girl who was supposed to go to Duke to build her own road. His mind raced not with remorse, but with a frantic, selfish need for self-preservation in a final, symbolic act of desecration. He tore the gold valedictorian sash from her body, ripped the diploma from its leather ret holder, and gathered her fallen cap. Thus were the things he had truly wanted to kill. He found a jagged piece of rock and frantically clawed at the soft earth, digging a shallow hole in the tangled, gnarled roots of the oak tree. He bundled her cap, sash, and diploma inside the white gown, shoved the entire bundle inside the hole, and covered it with dirt. Stomping it down with his polished dress shoes, he had buried her achievements. Then, under the deepening cover of dusk, he dealt with her body, taking her far from that place, ensuring that Tanya Maxwell would simply be gone, back at the school. An hour had bled into 2. The crowd had thinned to nothing, the sky turning a bruised, ominous purple. The tight knot of anxiety in Eleanor's stomach had become a churning sickness. She should have been back by now, she said, for the 10th time, her voice tight with a fear she was trying desperately to suppress. Robert, always the calm one, was now pacing his big frame of cage of nervous energy. They found Beau near the student parking lot, leaning against his shiny new car, laughing with a group of friends. He looked up as Eleanor and Robert approached, his expression shifting to one of perfect, placid innocence. Boo. "Where's Tanya, Eleanor?" demanded her voice, sharper than she intended. He held up his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. "Well, Mrs. Maxwell, she left. Said she was meeting some cousins to celebrate over in Florence, headed off toward the highway about an hour ago." The lie was so smooth, so plausible to an outsider. But it was a lie. All their family, every cousin they had in the state, had been at the ceremony. There was no one to meet on the highway. Eleanor knew it. She felt in her bones a cold, hard certainty. She wouldn't do that. She said, shaking her head, a wave of dizziness washing over her. She would have told us both, just shrugged. A perfect picture of casual indifference. "I don't know what to tell you." That's what she said by nightfall. They were frantic. They called the police. The officer who took the report at the station was a man named Miller, a white man with tired, cynical eyes who listened with barely concealed impatience. A teenage girl graduation night. She's probably just out celebrating Mrs. Maxwell, he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. She'll turn up when her money runs out. When they mentioned she was last seen with Beau Jackson, the officer's posture changed instantly. John Jackson's boy. Bose, a good kid, a little hot-headed maybe, but a good boy. I'm sure. It's just like he said, the questioning of Bo was a perfunctor, respectful conversation that took place in the comfort of his father's mahogany-paneled living room. There he repeated his story carefully, planting the seed of the narrative that would choke out the truth for 25 agonizing years. A girl like Tanya, he suggested with faux sympathy, from a neighborhood like hers. She gets a little taste of success, a big shot scholarship. It's not a surprise she'd be eager to leave this little town behind. Maybe she got a ride headed for a bigger city, a new life where she could be someone new. It was a story, poisoned with generations of racist assumptions, a convenient narrative that the biased 1981 King Street Junction police force was all too eager to consume. It required no real work, no uncomfortable questions aimed at a powerful local family. It fit their worldview perfectly. Eleanor's desperate pleas, her frantic insistence that her daughter, her responsible, loving, ambitious daughter, would never, ever just run off without a word, were dismissed as the predictable hysterics of a distraught mother. The official search was a sham lasting less than a week. My Tanya wasn't missing. She was just another black girl who had run away. And as the days turned into weeks, the lie hardened into accepted fact, and a terrible silence began to settle over their lives. The 25 years that followed were a thief in the night, stealing not possessions, but us, essentials. They stole Eleanor's husband. They stole her joy. They stole the very color from her world, leaving behind a dull gray expanse of time marked only by the changing of seasons she barely noticed. The first year was the loudest, filled with the noise of Eleanor's own desperate hope, a frantic energy that slammed daily against the brick wall of official indifference. She called the police station so many times that the dispatcher's voice would turn to ice the moment she recognized Eleanor's. She walked the woods behind the high school until her feet were raw, calling Tanya's name, until her throat was as if her voice alone could conjure her daughter from a silent, watchful pines. Eleanor and Robert put up posters. Their daughter's beautiful, smiling graduation picture, a picture taken just hours before she vanished, taped to telephone poles in the windows of the few businesses that would allow it. The posters were a temporary protest, a fragile defiance. Within weeks, they were torn down by teenagers or faded into ghostly images. Under the relentless Carolina sun, Tanya's image was disappearing from the town as surely as she had Robert Eleanor strong steady. Robert withered under the weight of it all. The unanswered question of what happened to his baby girl was a cancer on his soul. He stopped going to the barber shop on Saturdays for the town gossip. He stopped watching the Braves games with his friends. The deep rumbling laughter left his eyes first. Then it vanished from his voice entirely. He would sit for hours in his armchair, staring at nothing, lost in a labyrinth of grief and powerlessness. He died of a massive heart attack 7 years after Tanya disappeared. The doctor called it coronary artery disease on the death certificate, but Eleanor knew the truth. Robert died of a broken heart, a fatal wound inflicted by a town that had agreed in a quiet, unspoken consensus to forget their daughter. After Robert was gone, the small house they had shared for decades became a cavern of profanzanies. It was in this silence that Eleanor's vigil truly began. She never changed Tanya's room. It remained a perfect dust-free shrine to the future she was supposed to have frozen in the amber of June 1981. A blue and white Duke University pennant was still tacked to the wall above the headboard. Her textbooks were neatly stacked on her desk, a bookmark holding her place in a James Baldwin novel she would never finish. Her closet was full of the clothes she had been so excited to take to college, their bright 1980s colors, a stark contrast to the grayness of Eleanor's world. Sometimes in the dead of night, when a loneliness was a physical weight, Eleanor would go into the room, sit on the edge of the floral bedspread, and run her hand over the cool fabric, pretending she could hear her daughter's soft breathing from down the hall for a quarter of a century. Eleanor lived a half-life, a ghost in her own home, a woman defined not by who she was, but by the empty space her daughter had left behind. In King Street Junction, she became a quiet, somber fixture, the woman who had lost her child. People were kind in a distant, pitying way that kept her at a safe, emotional distance. They would stop her in the grocery store, pat her arm, and say, "How are you holding up, Eleanor?" They never said her name. Saying Tanya was a breach of the unspoken pact the town had made to move on from the uncomfortable, unsolved story. But Eleanor never moved on. She held her vigil with a quiet, unyielding dignity. Every year on Tanya's birthday, she baked her favorite caramel cake, and Robert, and she, and then for 18 years just she would eat a single slice in silence at the kitchen table every year. On the anniversary of her disappearance, she would put on her Sunday best, walk to the police station, and ask to speak to whoever was in charge. Chief Miller retired and was replaced by a new chief, and then another. Each time, Eleanor would sit in the same uncomfortable visitor's chair and calmly ask if there was any new information, any reason to reopen the case. The answer was always the same: a polite, weary no. She was a runaway, an adult. There was nothing to investigate. Meanwhile, Bo Jackson thrived. His life was a picture of Southern prosperity, a stark, cruel, and public contrast to the emptiness of Eleanor's. He attended a different university, not Duke, but a respectable one. In state, he came back to King Street Junction, married a girl from a similar influential family, and took over his father's successful construction business, Jackson and Son Construction. He had 2 sons and a daughter. A sprawling house with white columns on the nicest side of town, and a seed on the church. Deacon board, Eleanor would see him sometimes driving his expensive car, his face fuller, now softer with age, the very picture of a respected local businessman. He never looked her in the eye on the rare occasions they were in the same place. His gaze would slide past her, a flicker of something annoyance, discomfort, before his placid public mask settled back into place. He was a pillar of the community, and his terrible secret was buried deep, protected by time, power, and the town's collective, convenient amnesia. No one wanted to believe that the smiling man who sponsored the Little League team and donated generously to the church building fund could be a monster. It was and always had been far easier to believe the lie. Through all those years, Eleanor prayed. She prayed not for vengeance, but for an answer. An answer that would give her peace, that would give Tanya back her good name. She had no way of knowing that the answer was waiting, sleeping in the dark, tangled in the gnarled roots of a silent old oak tree, waiting for the world to finally be ready to listen. Autumn in 2006 arrived with a certain crispness in the air that felt different, a harbinger of change in a town that had long resisted it. Eleanor Maxwell was 65 years old. Her body stooped with the invisible weight of years and unspoken grief. Her once dark hair, now a crown of soft white. The old high school, the sacred and profane ground that was the scene of both her greatest pride and her deepest sorrow, was undergoing a massive renovation. The school district, flushed with new funding, had decided to expand to build a modern science wing and a state-of-the-art athletic complex. The news had been a quiet ache in Eleanor's heart, the landscape of her memory. The place where Tanya had last stood was being torn apart, leveled for a future that felt alien to her. One Tuesday morning in late October, the phone rang, its shrill sound startling in the quiet house. It was her neighbor Martha, her voice breathless and frantic. "Eleanor, you need to turn on the television right now. Channel 7. Something's happening at the old school." Eleanor's hand trembled as she reached for the television remote. Her heart, a slow and steady drum of grief for 25 years, began to hammer against her ribs with a violent, unfamiliar rhythm. The local news channel showed a chaotic scene broadcast live. Police cars were parked haphazardly on the old football field, their blue and red lights flashing silently, painting the trees in surreal, frantic strokes. Yellow crime scene tape, a color Eleanor had only ever seen on TV, cordoning off a large section of muddy, upturned land behind the gymnasium. A small crowd of onlookers stood at a distance, whispering their faces, a mixture of curiosity and dread. The camera zoomed in on a massive gaping hole in the ground, a raw wound in the earth where a giant of a tree had once stood. The reporter, a young woman with a serious face, stood before the scene, microphone in hand. "We're live in King Street Junction, where a multi-million-dollar construction project at the former high school has come to a startling and dramatic halt. Sources tell us that workers in the process of uprooting this ancient oak tree have made what is being called a grim and potentially significant discovery." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She pushed herself up from her armchair, her knuckles white as she gripped its worn fabric for support. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The reporter continued, her voice grave. "While details are still scarce and police are not commenting officially, we have learned that items unearthed by heavy machinery just this morning may be connected to a long unsolved disappearance that has haunted this community for a generation." They knew. After 25 years, they knew. The room spun, and Eleanor sank back in her chair, the reporter's voice becoming a distant buzz. The machine, a powerful excavator with a claw-like bucket, had been clearing the land where the old woods began. The ancient oak, the very one Eleanor had stared at for countless hours during her lonely, desperate walks, was the first to go. The machine's powerful arm had dug around its base, its metal teeth severing the thick, stubborn roots that had held it fast to the earth for a century or more. With a great groaning tear that sounded like the earth itself was screaming, the tree was ripped from the ground, its massive root ball a tangled, chaotic knot of wood and soil hoisted into the air. It was one of the workers, a man named Frank Henderson, who saw it first as the root ball was shaken by the operator to dislodge the excess dirt. A bundle of fabric, once white, but now stained dark with mud and mold, fell from the tangled mass with a heavy thud. Thinking it was just old trash, he was about to signal for it to be cleared away when the rotted bundle, its fabric weakened by 25 years of decay, tore open upon impact. What spilled out was not trash. The outer layer was unmistakably a graduation gown from its folds tumbled, a graduation cap, the tassel still miraculously attached, its threads of faded gold beside it. Something else slid from the mud, a cylindrical tube, a diploma holder, its faux leather covering cracked and peeling, and a flash of gleaming tarnished fabric. The valedictorian Sash Henderson. A man in his 40s had lived in King Street Junction. His whole life he had been a few years behind Tanya. Maxwell in school, he knew the stories. He knew the town's ghosts. His blood ran cold. He knew with absolute certainty whose things those had to be. He shouted his voice, and the work crew fell silent. The deafening rumble of the machinery died as a profound hush fell over the site. The foreman, his face pale, immediately called the police. And just like that, the past, violent and unresolved, came rushing back into the present with the force of a hurricane. The items were the symbols of a stolen life, buried in a hateful final act of erasure. Bo Jackson had tried to bury her achievements along with her, to negate the very essence of who she was. He had intended for them to rot away into nothing, just as he had intended for her memory to fade into the realm of sad local folklore. But the deep, gnarled roots of the old oak tree had cradled the bundle, protecting it from the full ravages of time and decay. The earth had held his secret, but the tree, in its final dying moments, had given it up as Eleanor sat there staring at the television screen. A new feeling began to push through the layers of shock. It was not hope, not yet. It was something sharper, harder. A feeling she had not allowed herself to have in decades. It was resolve. For 25 years. She had been the grieving mother of a runaway. Now, she was the mother of a girl whose memory had been unearthed. The lie was broken. The truth was finally coming. And Eleanor Maxwell would be there to meet it. The discovery of Tanya Maxwell's cap and gown was a bombshell that shattered the quiet, carefully constructed peace of King Street Junction. The cold case of the missing valedictorian was suddenly violently hot. A front-page story not just locally, but across the state and even nationally. The old files were pulled from the dusty archives at the county sheriff's office. The thinness of the folder, a testament to the institutional neglect and willful blindness of 1981. This time, however, the investigation would be different. Acknowledging the original CAS's profound failures, the county requested assistance, and the case was immediately handed over to the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division. SLE and SLED sent their best cold case man, Detective Darrell Barnes. Detective Barnes was a man in his early 50s, a career lawman with a quiet, methodical demeanor that belied a mind as sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. He was a black man born and raised in the Low Country, and he understood the complex, often unspoken racial dynamics of a town like King Street Junction, with an intimacy no outsider ever could. He was utterly unmoved by the old names and the old money that had so effectively deflected justice a generation earlier when he came to Eleanor's house, 2 days after the discovery. He didn't treat her like a fragile old woman or a hysterical mother, lost in time. He treated her like what she was, the primary witness in a 25-year-old homicide investigation. They sat at her kitchen table, the same table where Tanya used to spread out her homework. And for the first time in 25 years, Eleanor told the entire story to someone who was truly, deeply listening. She didn't just give him the bare facts. She gave him the rich, painful context that the original investigators had willfully ignored. She painted a vivid picture of her daughter's brilliance and fierce ambition. She described the simmering racial tensions at the school, the ugly whispers that followed her daughter's successes, the pervasive feeling that she was being watched, judged, and resented, and with a voice like cold steel, she told him about Bo Jackson. He was the runner-up. She said, her hands resting flat on the table, perfectly still. The salutiator and his family. This whole town expected him to be number one. He couldn't accept that Tanya had earned it on her own. She described in meticulous detail the look on Bose's face during Tanya's speech, a look of pure, unadulterated hatred that had been burned in her memory. She recounted the last time she saw her daughter walking away with Bia toward the very spot, the very tree where her things had just been found. I told them all of this. In 1981, she said, her voice laced with the bitterness of decades of injustice. I told Officer Miller she was last seen with him. They didn't listen. They listened to his father. Instead, Detective Barnes took notes in a small leather-bound book, his pen scratching across the page. He didn't interrupt. He just let her talk, his gaze patient, his eyes missing nothing. Not the tremor in her hands, not the fire in her eyes. Mrs. Maxwell, he said, when she had finally finished, his voice calm and deeply reassuring. We're going to get to the bottom of this. I promise you that. It was the first time in a quarter of a century that a promise from a man with a badge had felt like anything other than an empty, dismissive placation. The investigation began to move with a speed and thoroughness that was a quiet, damning indictment of the past. Detective Barnes and his team started with the physical evidence, the gown, the cap, the sash, the diploma holder. They were sent to the SLED forensics lab in Columbia, where technicians would painstakingly examine them for any trace evidence, any hair or fiber that might have miraculously survived the decades of burial. They began the mammoth task of tracking down and re-interviewing every living member of the King Street Junction High graduating class of 1981. At first, people were hesitant, their memories clouded by time and coated with the thick veneer of the official story. They had been told, "We all just thought she ran off," was the common weary refrain. But Detective Barnes was persistent and perceptive. He didn't ask what they thought, he asked what they saw. Who was Tanya talking to? What was her mood? Did anyone see her after the ceremony? The focus of the investigation quietly but relentlessly turned to Bo Jackson. He was now 50 years old, the owner of the most successful construction firm in the county, a father, a pillar of the community. When Detective Barnes and his partner first approached him at his sprawling office, bitch of cooperative civic concern, "It's just terrible. What happened to Tanya?" he said, shaking his head with a practiced, convincing somberness. "I can't believe they found her. Things after all this time. I can only hope it brings her poor mother some measure of peace." He repeated the same story he had told in 1981, a story he had rehearsed in his mind for 25 years. Tanya had told him she was leaving, meeting relatives, heading for a new life. He was just the last one to see her go. But this was not 1981. Bose's powerful father was long dead. The town, while still steeped in its old ways, was changing. And Detective Darrell Barnes was not the easily influenced, cynical Officer Miller. The detective began to meticulously deconstruct Bose's life, pulling financial records, old phone bills, tax documents, anything that could help paint a picture of his life then and now. The suspense in the town was a palpable thing, a thick fog of gossip and speculation. People started talking, really talking. For the first time, old rivalries, old slits from high school were resurrected no longer. Pieces of teenage gossip, but potential clues and motives for murder. The pressure on Bo began to build slowly at first. Then, all at once, his carefully constructed world, his public image as a good-natured family man, started to show microscopic cracks. He became irritable, snapping at his employees over minor details. He was seen having hushed, angry conversations on his cell phone in the parking lot of his own business. The man who had lived without fear for 25 years was now looking over his shoulder at every turn. The ghost of the girl he thought he had successfully erased, rising from the muddy earth to haunt him. Detective Barnes was circling, patient and methodical as a wolf, waiting for the one piece of evidence, the one witness that would allow him to finally tighten the net. And he knew with the cold certainty of a seasoned hunter that someone out there knew more than they were saying. Someone had seen something that night, and for 25 years they had been silent. It was time for them to talk. The break-in, the case came not from a 25-year-old fingerprint or a degraded DNA sample, but from a guilty conscience. A woman named Sarah Beth Collins, who had been the popular cheerleader, Sarah Beth Pua, back in 1981, was living a comfortable suburban life in Atlanta, working as a part-time accountant. She had seen a news story about the discovery at her old high school on the internet, shared by a friend on a net social media site. For 25 years, she had carried a secret, a memory she had successfully pushed down, convincing herself it was unimportant, just a detail clouded by the champagne she and her friends had snuck onto the football field that long ago graduation night. But seeing Tanya's smiling face on the screen, young and so full of hope, and reading about Eleanor Maxwell's long, lonely vigil, had awakened a deep, profound guilt that time had not managed to erase. With trembling hands, she found a sled tip line online and made the call. Detective Barnes drove the 4 hours to Atlanta to meet her in person in a quiet, sterile conference room in a downtown office building. Sarah Beth, a woman now in her mid-40s, finally unburdened her soul. "We were near the back parking lot by my friend's car," she told him, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes fixed on her own tightly clasped hands. "We were celebrating. I saw B and Tanya walk past us. They were heading toward the woods behind the gym." This much corroborated Bose's own story that they had walked off together. But then came the part she had kept to herself for a quarter of a century, the part she had been too scared to tell a few minutes later, maybe 10 at the most. "Bo came back," she said finally, looking up at Barnes, her eyes swimming with tears. "He was alone and he looked strange. His face was pale as a sheet, and he had this long, angry-looking scratch on his cheek near his eye. And there was dirt on the knees of his dress trousers." I remember thinking, that was odd. She had asked him jokingly, at first, where Tanya was. He told me she got a ride that she'd left, but he wouldn't look me in the eye. He seemed agitated, really angry. He told me to mind my own business. And then he just stormed off. At the time, she choked on a sob. "I just thought they'd had a bad argument when she was reported missing. I was scared the Jacksons were so powerful in that town. I was just a kid. I convinced myself it didn't mean anything, but meant everything. It was the fatal crack in Bo Jackson's 25-year-old alibi. It was the first independent witness who placed him as the last person with Tanya and described not only his suspicious behavior and emotional state, but physical evidence, a scratch and dirt immediately after her disappearance. It was enough armed with this new awful testimony. Detective Barnes brought Bo Jackson in for questioning again this time. It wasn't a polite chat at his office. It was a formal interrogation in a small, windowless cinder block room at the SLED regional headquarters. The respected businessman was gone, replaced by a pale, sweating man of 50, whose carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. For hours, he stuck to his story, his denials becoming weaker, more frantic, his voice cracking. Detective Barnes laid out the evidence with methodical calm, piece by damning piece. The location of the gown, right where he was last seen with her. The new witness testimony from Sarah Beth Collins, the scratch on his cheek. She remembered so vividly the dirt on his knees, finally under the relentless crushing weight of it all. After 25 years of lies, the dam of his deception broke Bo Jackson, the family man, the church deacon, the pillar of his community, confessed to the murder of Tanya Maxwell. The story he told was a pathetic, ugly tale of entitled jealousy and racist rage. He had lured her away not to talk, but to belittle her, to tell her she didn't deserve her success. But her defiance, her proud refusal to be intimidated by him, had sent him into a blind fury. He confessed to killing her in that fit of rage, to burying the symbols of her success in the roots of the old oak tree, and to disposing of her body in a blind panic. But then came the final, cruel, hateful twist, when Detective Barnes asked him the most important question. Where was Tanya's body? Where had he taken her? A cold, familiar arrogance returned to Bose's eyes. The pathetic, broken man vanished, and the monster reappeared. I don't remember. He said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He claimed he had blocked it out, that the location was lost to the trauma of the event. It was a transparent lie. It was his last hateful act of control. He would give him the truth of her death, but he would deny Eleanor and the world the peace of her burial. He would keep Tanya from her mother, even from behind the bars of a prison cell. Bo Jackson was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict was a vindication for Eleanor, but a hollow one. Her daughter's name was finally cleared. The shameful shadow of the runaway label was at long last lifted, but she still had no grave to visit, no place to lay a flower, no final resting place for her child. The following spring, Duke University and a new Florence County Community Foundation established the Tanya Maxwell Memorial Scholarship to be given each year to a deserving student from a disadvantaged background in her home county. They asked Eleanor to speak at the first awards ceremony held in the gleaming new auditorium of the renovated high school. She stood at a podium just as her daughter had 26 years earlier. She looked out at a new generation of hopeful faces, black, white, and brown, and she told them about Tanya. She spoke of her brilliance, her laughter, and her stolen potential. My daughter wanted to build her own road. Eleanor said, her voice clear and strong. Her journey was cut short by hatred, but her dream was not her dream. Now belongs to you. She had justice for her daughter's murder, but not the closure of laying her to rest for Eleanor Maxwell. The vigil was over, but the grief would be her constant companion until the end of her days. The story ends there with a scholarship that builds new roads in her name and a mother who finally knew the truth, but who would forever be searching the silent woods and the empty fields for the final resting place of her lost, brilliant child.